it's all about sharing info. And thankfully, you work at a company that allows you to do this, right? Because as you learn something, right, you can share with others. That way, maybe they don't make the same mistakes, or they take advantage of what you learned, those tips and tricks, and maybe they're more efficient. And we just keep making the community and everyone else better. So we really appreciate you being here, Aaron. And yeah, I think I should tell people, I guess, if you don't see it on the deck, Aaron works with Twilio, and has many years of experience doing InfoSec. I'm sure you'll have a slide on that as well. So go ahead and take it away, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, George, and really thanks to everybody who has been a part of this conference and the selection. This is my first talk in a virtual con. It's my first talk in a little while as well, post-COVID, and so bear with me a little. I'm used to having sort of, the reactions of the crowd to play off, but I'm going to try to do my best to give you all, like I said before, the behind-the-scenes look at what some things happen during incidents. Also, really, I am super thankful that I work for a company like Twilio, where one of the main reasons I joined the security team at Twilio 3 years ago was we want to be transparent. We want to share, we want to publish things open source, give people tools, but we also want to talk a lot about how our processes work and what that means, giving back to the community. So I'm gonna give you as much as I can about what we do and how we've sort of worked through this incident. Also, how you can be transparent and how that can help, and how you can potentially, argue with managers, management, leadership that transparency is a good thing, especially in the face of a security incident. So why listen to me when talking about these things? As George said, I run cybersecurity at Twilio, and I have quite a bit of experience. Before Twilio, I was at Apple. I am formerly a licensed attorney. I have put my status on hold because I don't practice law anymore. And then before that, I was a forensics investigator, and before that, I was just a little kid. This is, by the way, the best photo I think of me. Just proves that I am not particularly photogenic. Twilio, if you don't know us, we're a global customer engagement platform. We provide communications APIs. We provide software for our customers to reach their customers across a whole host of different channels. So you might know us as the texting company that sends a message when your DoorDash arrives. You might know us as a call center company. You might also know some of the companies that we've purchased, like Authy for two-factor authentication and Electric Imp for securing IoT devices. All of these things we do. We are also cloud native, so we grew up in AWS. We have a huge footprint in AWS, and so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is some of the things that we've learned, dealing with AWS in the cloud environment today. I hope that you will appreciate some of my opinions, but I will take the time, as I am an ex-licensed attorney, to make sure that you remember that the opinions that I'm going to give you today are my opinions. Some of them I have been able to convince the company are good opinions. Maybe I'll convince you they're good opinions. That's my hope. And if you want to hit me up afterwards and argue about them, I'm totally down for that. I think I'm kind of fun to listen to, so maybe those will resonate with you. But at the end of this, you'll decide whether you had a good time or not. And finally, I lived through a security incident. It was due to an Open S3 bucket. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, and then I'm going to tell you some of the things that I learned, and hopefully you can learn as well. So if you haven't read the blog post, in July of this year, Twilio experienced a security incident. I blogged about it. If you are watching this through the magic of YouTube or Vimeo or whatever, mash the 2 vertical bars, pause this, go read the blog post. It's got a lot more technical detail than I'm going to go into today, and it might help with some context. I'll give you as much of an overview as possible if you're live, and hopefully we'll be able to cover the basics of it. But I'll wait. If you want to read it now, go for it. Cool, we're back. So because Twilio is an API company, one of the things that we provide are SDKs. Some of those SDKs are things that developers would integrate into applications that they're building. So maybe it's something that's going to be compiled. But some of those SDKs are JavaScript libraries that we provide so that our customers can link to them, have their users download those libraries and run them at runtime. And this incident that I'm going to tell you about today involved one of those JavaScript libraries. Just for context, Task Router is the product, the tool that was implicated in this incident. It is essentially what it says it is. It routes tasks. It's a workflow engine. Our customers use it to do things like enhance the efficiency of a call center workflow. So if somebody calls in and they want to hit up a salesperson, press 1 to get to sales, press 2 if your company is located in North America, and it'll route you efficiently to the right place. There's a lot more you can do with it. I encourage everybody to check it out. It's a cool tool and a cool product, but that's probably about as much as we need to know. So, how did it work? This is a simplified architecture. It kind of goes through what I just said. Essentially, your users are going to hit your website at customer.com, and your website at customer.com in the HTML is going to have a script tag, and that script tag is going to tell the user's laptop or desktop or whatever browser to go grab this JS file. And that JS file is going to come down, and it's going to come through a Twilio service. It's not going to come through the customer's systems. The actual serve of that JS is, at least in the before time in the architecture that's depicted here, was through a Cloudflare CDN. And the JS file itself was stored in an AWS S3 bucket. So kind of the behind the scenes. At some point in the past, and this is in the blog as well, but at some point in the past, the permissions on the path that file is stored in S3 were set in a way that us security professionals did not appreciate. Essentially, the team was trying to troubleshoot an issue, putting data into that bucket. So what did they do? They said, well, anybody anywhere should be able to put data into the bucket, right? Like, that's how we troubleshoot. And so they opened it to the world. And then, for some reason, I'm not sure how or why, they just forgot to reset those permissions when they were done. It's probably the first time that's ever happened, right? My guess is it's happened to you, or it's happened to people you know. This is pretty typical. And so because they hadn't reset those permissions, that path was sitting there world writable for a very long time. And eventually, somebody came along and figured out how to get in there. I'll talk about the detective strategies and tools and the attack paths in a second. But what we did do, and what we at least, well, I guess we tried to do, was instead of serving that JS directly, you can see we served it through a CDN, which totally makes sense. So a user on the internet is going to get a link to a Twilio.com domain. It's going to point them through the CDN, and the CDN is going to serve up the file. That makes a lot of logical sense, right? We'll explore in a minute why that wasn't necessarily the best thing, but just kind of keep in the back of your head, misconfigurations, architectural decisions, design choices at a stage like this, at the design stage of a flow like this, have serious repercussions, and you really need to think through them all when you're doing your builds. Out things like when there's a really public breach, ransomware issue at a car manufacturer, or an issue with account takeovers at a particular social media company. We'll go through the exercise of seeing how that would impact Twilio, and we use the cyber attack kill chain to do it. We also, that means, model the stuff that actually happens to us. And so in this particular case, walk through the kill chain a little bit and give you some insight into what happened. Obviously, step one is recon. Somebody out there, an unknown attacker to us right now, was trying to probably find open S3 buckets, writable S3 paths, and eventually they came across one of ours. Now, It's not entirely clear to us right now how that happened, but it certainly did, and it was certainly feasible and possible. So in the reconnaissance phase, this attacker found that path, found the file that was there, and was able to understand what that file was. Moving on, they weaponized. They grabbed the JS that we had posted up there. They added a couple of lines to it, and the specific lines, again, you can find in the blog post, that redirected the users that executed that JS in their browsers through a series of really interesting little HTML tricks that made it impossible for the users to use their back buttons, and basically served up adware. So I'm certain that they've done it before. They've done it before. The reason why we were able to figure out in our analysis what was going on was because this had happened to other people, and others had blogged about it. So it was a pretty simple weaponization, in my opinion. And then they delivered it. Basically, they took advantage of the writable path. They used potentially a AWS CLI. They used potentially the browser. It doesn't really matter, but via a Tor node, so that we couldn't tell who they were. They pushed that up to the S3 bucket that was serving out our production instance. Now, what's interesting, I think, about S3, and I'll pause for a second on this, is AWS S3 is a global namespace, which means that every bucket that we've created has to be unique within that namespace. And one of the ways to make something unique when you still want to have a differentiation between like your dev, your test, or stage, your production environment, is to do something like call it com.twilio.dev.bucket name and com.twilio.prod.bucket name. Now that's pretty guessable, right? So even if the attacker who was doing the recon found the dev bucket at some point in the past, they could very easily try to model out that, oh, if they have dev and they have stage, then they probably have prod, and it's probably named the same thing. So it makes this delivery phase even nastier when you start to recognize some of the choices you might make in the development phase could just make it a lot easier for people to understand and guess what you're doing. And then finally, exploitation. Exploitation happened on users' machines. It happened when they downloaded the modified JS and they executed it. And the rest of the kill chain kind of doesn't make a lot of sense for this attack just because of the way it was played out. But this is essentially what happened. All right. So now I'll give you a little bit of the overview of where our teams stepped in once that attack was carried out. So at some point, all of that recon happened. The attacker uploads, and around 1:00 p.m. Pacific time, the modified JavaScript file was put into the writable path in our S3 bucket. Our teams internally were alerted about 8 hours later that that bucket had potentially been damaged, that the file had been modified, and that we were serving up something that we may not have intended to serve up. That's not a bad time to detect. We could have done better. Talk about that in a little bit. We immediately started executing our incident response plan. And again, what's I think fortunate and what I love about my team is we've done this before. We've played these games. We've modeled this out. We have plans in place. And so our remediation time was particularly quick. We were able to remove the modified JavaScript. We were able to restore a good version. We were able to remediate the permissions that allowed the attack to happen in the first place very, very rapidly. And mind you, this was on a weekend. It was definitely not working hours for most of the team that was responding. And so by responding so quickly, we were able to do a lot of things. We were able to pull in the right teams. So we pulled in our legal team, we pulled in our PR team, because our incident response plan has that enabled because they have pager duty rotations so that we can pull them in during off hours. We were assessing impact, trying to figure out from a forensics capacity what the modifications actually did. And we were able to notify at least the customers that were impacted within a very short period of time. And so that, I think, is sort of number one on my hit list of things to get across in this talk. Being upfront with impacted customers as soon as possible is what you have to do. You may have contractual obligations to do it. You may just know that it's inherently a good idea, but that's where our incident response plan really pushes us. We wanted to make sure that our customers that were impacted knew about it. After that, we had a little bit of a lag time because we were using the CDN, by which there was about a 24-hour time that we would expect that all of the cached versions of the JS would be purged from the CDN. And so we were, while waiting for that to happen, continuing to run our playbook, continuing to do our notification, and we were starting to write the public blog post that was put up. In the interim, somebody wrote a story. There was a news story that was published on the Register that contained some language from the notification that we had sent to our customers. And we then had a very quickly after that, a press inquiry about the incident. Now, what was nice, of course, is because we had involved our press team early on in our incident process, they were ready. They knew that it was coming. They were prepared to deal with the inquiry with a statement to say that we were going to publish what we had very shortly. Of course, it accelerated a little bit the plans that we had to publish, but it made it very clear that we needed to get that blog post out. What was amazing, I think, is that once we did publish that post, and once we did lay out this timeline, all of the facts that we knew about the case, all of the forensic evidence that we had been able to collect to date, a lot of news stories followed. And almost every single one of them was the recitation of the incident from our perspective. Essentially, we owned the narrative. And that was what was really important to us as an incident response team and as a company, because it was our incident. We wanted to be upfront about it. We wanted to make sure everyone who needed to know what happened knew. And then now I get to give back to all of you, and hopefully you can learn from the things that we have gone through. So I promised a little bit about tooling and some attack paths and some defense stuff. This is a Purple Team Summit, so I want to make sure that I cover all of that fun stuff and give you some of the challenges that created the situation, some of the mitigations that we've committed to doing, and some of the things that are interesting about Twilio that I've found, having come from non-cloud native companies into Twilio, which is a definitely different environment. So I want to play one of my new favorite games, which is called Find the Edge. So here's a diagram. Disclaimer, this is not my architecture. I take no responsibility for it. This is a reference architecture for WordPress. Whether you think that WordPress is malware in and of itself, notwithstanding, I think this is a really good example of how things changed from the traditional data center model into the cloud data center model. So pretend for a minute that you're building a network in the late 90s. I built a lot of them. They were really simple. If I was lucky, I had multiple fiber optic T1 lines that I was plugging into a couple of highly available carrier grade routers. That was if I had a ton of money. Otherwise, I'd have like a business class DSL link. And essentially in both instances, I could find a wire, I could cut the wire, and I could turn off the internet. And I knew that that was the edge of my network. And it was really clear that I could turn on and turn off anything. I could keep data from flowing in and flowing out from a single point. And you look at a reference architecture like this, and I'd say, okay, there's an internet gateway. Like, it's right there. It says internet gateway. That's definitely an edge of the network. That's a point where there's a transaction with the internet. But wait, there's more. Because how many edges do you see in this document? I'm not really sure, honestly. I mean, I can count a few. Route 53 DNS with Amazon sits out on the internet. CloudFront is a distribution network. That might be an interesting edge. It's definitely serving stuff out. S3, absolutely. Global namespace. We all know that we got attacked there. Amazon EFS, I'm not sure, but it sits outside of the VPC in this reference architecture. So it's got to be accessible beyond the confines of the cloud that you've created for your internal stuff. So I think, yeah, it's probably a place where data might flow. And oh yeah, by the way, the application load balancers, those you probably need to expose one way or another, whether it's through the CDN or not. All of these entry points and exit points create a lot of attack surface. And it's really hard, even when you have tools that are looking at each of these identifiable points that your developer teams might be using, to miss stuff. Because it's not as simple as saying, all right, I know that S3 is an edge of my network. I know there's data stored there. I know that people can get it out, and I know that people can put it in, and that's a threat, and that's something I want to protect against. Even looking at whether or not certain settings are configured on those AWS S3 buckets doesn't necessarily tell you whether or not the data in them is public or private. So one of the things that we learned in this particular incident is, even though you may say, don't share this S3 data for the bucket, because at the bucket level, most of the data that was stored in our bucket was private. You can create an ACL at the path level that says, oh yeah, by the way, this one's public. Now, AWS certainly has controls today that you can use to turn off all public access and nothing can override it. You have a lot of tools that they provided to detect some of these misconfigurations as well. Totally encourage the use of those things. But it's really confusing, and if you don't have the right people looking at the right things at the right times, you very well may miss something. And so, it's one of those things to be very careful about, and one of those things that we, while doing best practices, we can all still miss. So with all of that in mind, let's look back at our architecture, because there are some things that we could have done a little bit differently, and some things that we definitely are doing differently. So again, remember I said up front, we serve this S3 bucket through a CDN, and that's a good choice. But there are a couple of things that work against us. Number one, the CDN that we're serving from is Cloudflare, and that means that we have to, by definition, make the things that are going into that CDN accessible to it. And so something about our S3 permissioning means that we have to let an external source read directly the data that we're providing. As well, the global namespace works against us. As I said before, it makes it a lot easier for somebody to understand. If you have dev, you have stage, you probably have prod too. So we could have, so you can in that first thing, remember that you can go straight to the S3 bucket, not going through the CDN. So we could have replaced Cloudflare with CloudFront. The CloudFront CDN, the AWS native one, through the magic of AWS internals, and highly encourage you to ask people at AWS about how their secret sauces work and why things are magic. CloudFront would allow us to say, only expose this data from S3 to CloudFront, and the only way to get to that S3 bucket is through CloudFront. And that would have eliminated this path where you could go straight to the S3 bucket. That would have been ideal, and would have totally eliminated the need for this talk. But that's as well. Of course, we could have made things a lot less easy to guess. And so, knowing that we have global namespace in S3, we could have done something with our orchestration tooling, because we have quite a bit of it, that says through the orchestration tooling, create like a metadata map and say, I want to create a bucket with a human readable name. And on the back end, that bucket's going to get created with some kind of machine parsable GUID. And that way we could at least obfuscate what data is in what buckets. Now, I don't think that that's a particularly amazing solution, because you could still enumerate through the global namespace, but it might have helped us here. It might have at least made reconnaissance a lot harder to do in our instance. Side note, it definitely would help with the ridiculous number of bug bounty submissions that we get, where people find a bucket called like com.twilio.i.swear.twilio.created.this.bucket, where it's just somebody who created a bucket called something Twilio. And so everything that has that name is somehow associated with us in bug bounty. I think that's probably a decent benefit as well. So the second thing we could have done, and what we have committed to doing, and we did immediately with TaskRouter and are doing with the rest of our SDKs, and I admit this is like the worst slide in this deck, but we could have implemented sub-resource integrity or something similar. And basically, it's my opinion that if you're going to put something out on the internet, you should at least certify that it's yours. You should hash it, you should sign it, you should do something that tells people this is the official distribution of my thing. And sub-resource integrity is a way to do that, specifically with JavaScript files that are being served through CDNs. It's a browser extension that I believe is very widely supported at this point, and would have absolutely helped in a case like this. Essentially, we have, with TaskRouter, we have hashed that good version of the JavaScript, we have published that hash, and then we encourage people to consume that hash, put it into the HTML, and then let the browser decide whether or not the script that it's executing matches that hash. All right. So we all know about security through obscurity. We've talked a lot about the things that Twilio did, choices we made, things we could have done better. So now let's talk about showing people our dumpster fires, because this is where I think the rubber meets the road. We definitely made mistakes. We wanted to cop to them and talk about the mistakes as much as possible so that everyone can learn from it. And so there are two things then that I think are important. One is from the outside looking in. And I talked a little bit already about what we did. Customer communications, it is incredibly important, I think, to be quick. Again, sometimes you may have contractual obligations about this. Sometimes you may just need to do it because it's the right thing to do. But you want to make sure that anyone who's impacted by an issue finds out about it from you, and not from a news article or a third party or someone that is not going to tell the story the way it really is. You need to be correct. Obviously, I think that that's important. And you need to be prepared. So having, for us, being able to work through tabletop exercises with our press team makes it possible for us to activate them appropriately when we need them. And I think just doing that, having that muscle, exercising quite frequently is very important to make sure that you're ready. And knowing how you would communicate specifically to customers. And whether you would communicate via the press or a public post, or whether you would communicate privately through account management or through your leadership team, those decisions are decisions you don't want to make in the heat of the moment under the duress of an incident. Press comms, you want to use experts. Now, that to me means you want to use an expert at press communications, somebody who knows how to deal with reporters. But you also want to use your subject matter experts to produce an appropriate documentation of what you actually experienced. You don't want your PR person to be trying to explain sub-resource integrity or S3 bucket security policies, just like you don't want somebody like me to be talking to a reporter and forget to say, oh yeah, by the way, that's on background or off the record. So you need both, you really do. And then plain language. What's interesting sort of in my career, why I think it's important that I put the I did go to law school thing in my bio, is the first thing that I learned in my legal writing class in law school was don't write in legalese. And it's counterintuitive, I think, for a lot of people who look at legal writing and say, wow, that's Latin and weird and all these weird terms. But in reality, when you're writing to convince a judge about something, what your side is saying is the right side, you want to do it as simply, as clearly, as plainly as possible. And that follows through to these types of communications as well. You don't want to try to wrap things up in BS or technical jargon or terminology that not everyone's going to understand. You want to cut to the chase. You want to be as transparent as possible and write simply. And then finally, you need to own the narrative. You acknowledge things publicly and report what you know. You tell your customers what they can do, how they can help themselves, and you cop to the mistakes and figure out what you're going to do to improve. Never let a good incident go to waste. The ability to mitigate things is something that you can drive based on the issues that have happened to you today. And owning the narrative means that you don't have to worry about being on defense every time something new comes up, some new inbound inquiry. Hey, did you know about this? Or wait, does this issue affect you too? You want to be offensive, quite frankly, with what you're saying and how you're positioning the incident in the public. Ultimately, doing this for us didn't just get us the kind of the good graces of the reporters kind of following the story that we had laid out, but it also got us a bunch of kudos from people in the security community who were really happy that a company would be willing to share as much as we did. And I think that's important. I think we've built trust both with our customers and with the security community in general. And because Twilio is a developer first company, we want to make sure that we've engendered trust with them as well. But don't forget that there's another set of constituents you have when you're dealing with incident response. And this is admittedly an area where we identified internally we needed to improve on. So all of the practices, all of the play we did to drive us through IR were really focused on making sure that we preserved the reputation of the company and that we could address the security incidents well. But there are still internal stakeholders. And you can't forget the value of not just talking to an external reporter, but talking to your sales, your go-to-market team, talking to your frontline customer support reps who every day their job is to take inquiries from people who may or may not be customers, who might be prospects. They're going to ask questions, especially if they see stuff. And for us to not include them in the loop and not provide them with at least as much information as we're providing outside the house is definitely a mistake. They should be best armed. They are the ones that are going to have the initial conversations with customers or with individuals. and they need to know what to do, and they need to know what they can and can't say. Now, it's really important to ensure that as you're developing the muscle and the process for sharing this kind of information with internal teams, that you know their interests may not be aligned with yours. And so as an incident responder, as a security professional, you really do want to get to the bottom of the issue and you want to fix it. Your sales team, they want to land deals. And so it needs to be really clear what you're saying as the security team is marked. Dear sales team, you can share this, but you can't share this. Or you can email them this, but you can only tell them this other stuff in person or on the phone or on a call. Being very prescriptive about where those lines are is really important. And one of the things that we've started to do is borrow from the threat intel world and use traffic light protocol internally, so we can mark things as, this is green, you can share this. This is yellow, you can't. This is red, don't even talk about it, right? That's the second bullet. I forgot to advance. And finally, escalation is good. The surprising thing that I have learned, in many years of doing this is nobody likes surprises. We're going to surprise them because security incidents happen and you aren't necessarily ready for it. But that doesn't mean that when you're in the midst of something that you should try to sweep it under the rug, that you should try to hide it, that you should say, you know what, I can deal with this. This is my job. I'm an incident handler. I'm gonna be the person that deals with this thing, and that way I'm gonna keep it out of the executive team's eyes. They won't need to know about it. Not a great strategy. Making sure that you are internally open and transparent, that you know how to escalate things so that it gets the right level of visibility, will get you towards that line of not letting a good incident go to waste. You'll get potentially buy-in, not just for the post-incident fixes, but also for your process. If you want to advance this idea that we need to be transparent, we need to tell people what happened, getting the executive team on board early is the way to do it. Because ultimately, it's their decision. Your leadership's going to decide whether or not you can share what's going on. And so to be open with them, to tell them what's going on, and to keep them in the loop will, I think, buy you a lot of credibility in being able to set that direction for the company overall. So those are my opinions. I really feel strongly about pushing for this kind of transparency. I think it's a really good thing. I think it's the only way that we learn as professionals, and I'm hopeful that you'll all see some things similarly. And that's my talk for today. Thank you so much for listening to me.